Winston Churchill is remembered in the West as a hero, a man whose face appears on currency and whose statues stand outside parliaments as the ultimate symbol of democratic defiance. In Tehran, that name carries a different weight. Iranians remember Churchill as the architect of their country's democratic collapse. In 1953, Churchill directed a quiet intelligence operation that set in motion a sequence of revolutions and regional conflicts that would eventually redefine the modern Middle East. To understand the headlines you read today, we have to look past the myth of the wartime savior and examine the calculus of an imperial leader. That calculus began in 1911, when Churchill converted the British Royal Navy from coal to oil. It was a visionary move that made the British fleet faster and more dominant than any coal-powered rival, but it also created a permanent existential dependency. The fleet that projected British power across the globe now relied entirely on a steady supply of petroleum from the Persian desert. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian oil company operated the largest refinery in the world at Abadan. It generated record-breaking profits for London, while the Iranian workers lived in conditions that mirrored indentured servitude. In 1951, Mohammad Mosaddegh was elected prime minister with a clear mandate. A Swiss-educated lawyer and a lifelong parliamentarian, he argued that Iran deserved to be treated as a sovereign nation rather than a resource colony. Mosaddegh signed legislation to nationalize Iran's oil. For the first time, Iranians took control of the industry that had been fueled by their own natural resources. When Churchill returned to power that same year, he faced a dilemma: respect the sovereignty of a democratic ally, or protect the fuel supply of the British Empire. Churchill's first attempts to intervene were rebuffed.
The Truman administration in Washington refused to help a colonial power overthrow an elected government to protect a private oil company. Churchill waited for the inauguration of Dwight Eisenhower in 1953 to pivot his strategy. British intelligence reframed the Iranian situation for the new administration. They stopped talking about oil profits and instead pointed to Iran's long shared border with the Soviet Union, arguing that Mosaddegh was a weak leader who would allow communism to seize the oil fields. By framing a colonial resource dispute as an urgent Cold War crisis, Churchill successfully convinced America that a coup was a strategic necessity. In August 1953, the CIA and MI6 launched a joint mission, Operation Boot, to manufacture a total political crisis in Tehran. Intelligence officers used American cash to hire paid mobs. They bribed the Iranian press to publish anti-government propaganda and paid religious figures to turn their congregations against the prime minister. To prevent a bloody civil war, Mosaddegh surrendered. He was tried by a military court and spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. Within 72 hours, the oil was flowing to London again. The Shah returned from exile and was restored to power as an absolute monarch. Churchill achieved his strategic objective and never expressed regret. To him, Iranian democracy was an expendable pawn on a global chessboard. The 1953 coup dismantled the most vibrant political ecosystem in the Middle East: a functioning parliament, a free press, and diverse political parties. To maintain control, the Shah established SAVAK, a brutal secret police force created with Western assistance. Over the next 26 years, SAVAK systematically eliminated the secular left and the democratic nationalists. This effectively destroyed the moderate political middle of Iranian society. By the time the revolution arrived in 1979, the political space once held by Mosaddegh was empty. The uprising became a pressure cooker of fury against decades of Western-backed repression. Ayatollah Khomeini filled the resulting power vacuum because the moderate, democratic alternatives had been systematically removed over the previous quarter century. The consequences of 1953 manifested in a total revolution that swept away every Western interest in the country. The hostage crisis that followed created an institutional paranoia toward Western intentions that still shapes Iranian policy today. Whenever Western governments talk about supporting democracy today, Iran calculates the distance between those words and the foreign money that destroyed their own democracy in 1953. Winston Churchill is rightfully remembered for saving democracy in Europe. But we must also remember that he quietly purchased and buried it in Tehran. The ghost of that decision still haunts the world today. Picture the Abadan refinery in the summer of 1953. This sprawling complex was the largest oil processing facility in the world, a maze of steel built to fuel an empire. Yet it sat paralyzed. It was a dormant cathedral of the industrial age, totally silent. When the Iranian government officially took control of the facility, the departing British engineers didn't walk away empty-handed. They committed a precise act of technical sabotage. They hid essential spare parts and packed the intricate operating manuals into briefcases, taking all the required knowledge with them. Iran had legally nationalized its oil reserves, taking back ownership of its own natural wealth. But ownership meant nothing without the ability to process it. Without British expertise to navigate the complex machinery, the world's largest refinery became a giant rusting monument. Winston Churchill used this monopoly of engineering knowledge to orchestrate a silent siege. He proved that a major power can suffocate a nation's economy simply by denying it the technical ability to operate its own industry. Standing against this blockade was Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh. He maintained a firm, defiant stance, arguing on the global stage that Iranian law protected his right to control the country's resources, regardless of the economic pressure mounting against his people. But that ironclad legal defiance at the top of the government was not shared by the monarchy. Young Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi felt the heavy weight of British expectations and buckled under the anxiety of a collapsing economy. Convinced his nation was lost to the crisis, the Shah abandoned his post. He fled Iran entirely, pacing in a hotel room in Rome, hiding from the very political storm he was supposed to navigate. A defiant prime minister holding the line, and a terrified monarch abandoning the throne. This contrast created a desperate power vacuum, giving Western intelligence agencies the exact vulnerability they needed to intervene. The conflict quickly moved away from international courts and down into the back alleys of Tehran. This was the domain of CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt, who arrived to direct Operation Ajax. Roosevelt's primary weapon was a literal safe filled with over $1 million in crisp 1953 greenback currency. This money moved through the city's underground, purchasing the loyalty of police chiefs and radio announcers. That cash also funded what became known as the Gray Press. Almost overnight, the CIA established a network of seemingly authentic newspapers that blanketed the streets with carefully planted rumors. Iranians woke up daily to fabricated stories of Mossadegh forging secret alliances with the Soviet Union. Behind the smokescreen of political ideology, Operation Ajax operated as a sheer financial transaction. A nation's democratic future was systematically dismantled and bought out dollar by dollar. To make this coup look like a massive civilian uprising, the CIA needed a crowd. They hired the Zor Khaneh, the traditional powerhouse wrestlers of Tehran, to serve as the physical muscle of the operation. Figures like Shaban Jafari, known locally as Brainless Shaban, were paid to lead mobs through the streets, burning tires and smashing windows to manufacture the appearance of absolute anarchy. The chaotic scenes unfolding in the streets were a highly coordinated illusion. It was manufactured theater, rigidly scripted and authorized from thousands of miles away in Washington and London. By August 19th, the psychological operations and street-level violence culminated in a final military assault, the Night of the Tank. For 9 hours, heavy military hardware was unleashed on the Prime Minister's private residence. American-supplied Sherman tanks turned their barrels on Mossadegh's home, turning the heart of Tehran into a war zone that left hundreds of people dead in the crossfire. Mossadegh had successfully defended his country's sovereignty using the legal framework of the World Court. The West answered that victory with purchased mobs and iron artillery. Once the smoke cleared, the new regime orchestrated a theatrical trial for Mohammad Mosaddegh. The proceedings were broadcast globally, designed specifically to humiliate the ousted leader and justify the siege. But the elderly prime minister used the courtroom to make a visual statement of his own. For weeks, he appeared before the military judges wearing his pajamas, a symbol of his physical frailty against the heavy machinery of the state. The psychological tactic backfired. Instead of seeing a defeated politician, the Iranian public saw a man who refused to yield his dignity. He became a lasting martyr for national sovereignty. While Mossadegh faced military judges, the Shah received the signal to return from Rome. He flew back to Tehran to take his seat on the peacock throne, adorned in medals and the formal trappings of a king. Yet the Shah returned with the knowledge that his authority was a gift from foreign intelligence, one that could be revoked just as easily as it was given. The true prize of the coup was finally revealed with the formation of the consortium. The previous British oil monopoly was dismantled, but it wasn't returned to the Iranians. Instead, it was splintered into a web of American, British, and French companies, sharing the vast petroleum wealth. The resulting economic windfall bypassed Iranian villages entirely. The revenue flowed directly into Western bank accounts, traded for heavy military hardware meant to keep the Shah securely in power. Over the next few decades, watching their lifeblood pumped away by foreign interests bred a deep-seated cultural resentment. Intellectuals coined the term Westoxification, a powerful anti-Western rallying cry that spread throughout the public. The Islamic Republic didn't emerge from a vacuum. The roots of the 1979 revolution were planted during the suppression of the 1953 democratic movement. The public outrage had simply boiled under pressure for 26 years. Churchill secured Britain's energy supply in 1953, but that tactical success came at a permanent cost. By prioritizing resource control over Iranian sovereignty, he traded short-term oil for 70 years of blowback that still defines the Middle East today.